This episode is brought to you by O.H. Ingram River Aged Whiskey. O.H. Ingram River Aged is the only whiskey in the world aged in a floating barrel house on the Mississippi River. The constant motion of the river combines with its distinct microclimate to provoke a unique interaction between the whiskey and the barrel that is unachievable in a traditional barrel house. The Mississippi's powerful current, its humidity and extreme temperature fluctuations ensure that the whiskey never stops working inside those barrels. It is a modern innovation inspired by tradition. Please visit ingramwhiskey.com to learn more and find your closest retailer. That's ingramwhiskey.com. Right, welcome to a very special episode of Between the Levees. I'm joined today by the proprietor of O.H. Ingram Whiskey, Mr. Hank Ingram. Thank you for joining me.
Good morning, Tim. Great to be with you.
Tell me a little bit about your business.
Well, we age bourbon and whiskey inside of a barge on the Mississippi River. So we are the only whiskey company out there, and maybe the only barge company aging whiskey in a barge. Now, we do that because it changes the way the whiskey and the barrel interact together, but I'm sure we'll get into that later.
I think so. Is it just one barge still?
We are actually up to our second barge. So we've got I&O 8 one side. I wish I had the number. They would be on the label there. Yep, that barge.
IN 068518 was the first one.
That's right. Now we've got an ING 1408, I think. It rolls off the tongue a little easier.
Sure. How many barrels fit in each barge?
3,000 barrels.
Really?
Yeah. And now that's because we rack them in a certain way where they're on their side, so it allows the whiskey to get a little bit more surface area than if we were just stacking them up on pallets, for instance.
Well, some time ago you were born, I assume around the Nashville area. Tell me a little bit about that.
Well, I don't remember the early days of it, but I was born in 1990 and grew up actually in Nashville and in Birmingham. So parents divorced and grew up kind of between the two towns. I really, I'd say, got exposed to the river at a young age. Being in the business, I had the opportunity to grow up around it, but did not know much about barges or the river or how big they were, what they moved. It was just, Dad went off and came back at the end of the day, and I know there are these boats, but I didn't know a whole lot more other than that. Certainly didn't know you could age whiskey in them.
Sure. Took a few years to figure that one out. What did your father do with the company at the time?
So in the early 90s, my grandfather passed away, Bronson Ingram, in 95. And so my dad and uncle, my dad's Orrin and my uncle John, they basically took over the company with their mother stepping in as chairman, and I'd say she kept she kept everything running and kept the order at the dinner table. And Dad really spent his time on the barge side, and Uncle John spent his time on the book side. So they each had their own area of specialization. But again, it was one of those things. Business really never came home, so I just knew Dad did something on the river. I just never really knew what.
Now, back in, I believe it was 1946, your grandfather began an oil company?
Yeah, so, great-grandfather, O.H. Ingram, who also went by Hank Ingram, he actually married a girl from, I think, St. Paul, and moved the family down to Nashville. Her family had an interest in the tufting business, and which I think they made socks is another fancy way of tufting means socks. and he sold that business and used the income there to get us into the oil business. So Koch Industries today, the owners of that business and well, their father and my great grandfather were business partners on the in the 30s on this oil refinery called Wood River Oil Refining. And in order to move the product out of the refinery, they had to essentially rely on barges. There wasn't great standardization in the industry at the time, and there was not a high degree of reliability. So they figured we can we can do this ourselves, and started a barge business just to move the oil around. So that was the beginning of Ingram Barge Company. Was 1946.
Okay. Then they were involved in a refinery down here in Louisiana at some point. Is
That's
that
right.
correct?
Yeah. Uh, the specifics I'd say have been best recounted to me by my grandmother around the dinner table. But yes, built a refinery there in Miro. Um, it was to take advantage of the government at the time in the 70s had changed the import rules and were going to allow refining of light sweet crude, for which this refinery was built. And actually, right before it was finalized or finished, the government changed the rules, and so um, had to figure out what to do with this refinery, which had a bit of a rule change in the middle of construction. So, it was an interesting chapter, I'd say, in the family history. But um, the, uh, the oil side of the business, my grandfather and his brother, uh, they actually wound up splitting the company. It used to be Ingram Corporation, and my grandfather split off from my great uncle who kept the oil side of the business, and then my grandfather kept the barge side, and which was early Ingram Book Company at the time, and that's when Ingram Industries began.
Okay. And these days, I did see that you were involved to some degree in this the soccer club. How
Yeah.
recent was that? Tell me about that.
Well, so the soccer club was a really interesting uh, turn of events. If you go back to, oh gosh, make sure I get my timeline here. I think it was 2000, it was beginning of 2016, and Nashville um, was not it was a Predators and Titans town. Um, Major League
Right.
Soccer had announced that they were going to take an expansion from, I think at the time it was 24 teams. They were going to go up to 28 teams and hold off on expansion for a bit. So there were four new expansion slots that were coming out. And uh, there was a group here in Nashville that approached my uncle. And my uncle's a bit of a sports enthusiast, to say the least, and said, would you
Sure.
be interested in leading an ownership bid to try to bring a Major League Soccer team to Nashville? I mean, this group literally cold called the offices of Major League Soccer and said, "Hey, we'd like to bring a team to Nashville." And I think they eventually got the right person who said, "Well, that's nice. There's about a dozen other cities that have been working on this for years, so the chances of you landing an expansion franchise are limited, but we appreciate the interest." And at the time,
Yep.
the guys were really just trying to do this as a uh, business development, economic development for Nashville, and show Nashville as a world-class city because soccer is a global sport, and so that was really the impetus behind that. So, to make a long story long, my uncle led up this bid to bring Major League Soccer to Nashville, and we had a lot of things go really, really, really right for us. Primarily, all those other cities ahead of us weren't Nashville, in some extent, so they had some issues that they couldn't get to the finish line. Nashville's got this really great ability to come together around big things and put politics and personal uh, beefs aside and really coalesce. And the mayor at the time uh, lent her support and this bid, which started out um, really as the 13th of 12 cities vying for an expansion over the course of a year, uh, pretty much got the stadium plan done, proved that Nashville was a soccer market, and at the end of it all, were awarded an expansion before any of the other 12 cities announced, and just a testament to, I think, a lot of people coming together. It really took a village in that respect. Now, I helped out in a very, very small fashion with the financial modeling. I had just finished my business school MBA at Vanderbilt, and they said, "Hey, we need somebody to help with the financial modeling." So um, I jumped in on that. At once the team was awarded, there was a lot of behind the scenes work to make that franchise come together, and they said, "Hey, would you want to continue on helping out?" And I said, "Of course. I mean, soccer's fun. I mean, who doesn't want to say yes to an opportunity to work in sports? It's kind of a small world." And we hired a gentleman named Ian Ayre, who was the CEO of Liverpool, from Liverpool, and actually the CEO of the soccer club. Was the last year he was there, 2016, I think he was awarded CEO of the year for the Premier League. So really a top dog, and got to uh, work with him. Nicest guy. I mean, just a real stand-up individual. And he said, "Well, Hank, I noticed you like to talk, and you're a great salesman. So why don't you help us out on the sponsorship side, and help put together some sponsors for the new team, which didn't exist. Which, by the way, selling a vision of soccer in the South uh, when people can't see it, and we had
Yeah.
this idea that the soccer was going to be we were going to keep a very clean look. Again, Ian uh, really had, I'd say, a lot of great vision there. And so we were out in the market asking what for Nashville would be kind of above market rates, but saying, well, look, you're going to be one of a few. We're not going to just put a sticker on anything in the building. And it resonated with some folks. It didn't resonate with others, but really learned a lot about telling a story, and selling the vision of something to come. And I think applying that in the whiskey has been it's been tremendously helpful, because I'll tell you, the barge business and the whiskey business are very different. Business to business and business to consumer, building a brand is a whole different animal. And so what's great about sports is it's really both. There's a business side of it, but then there is very much that consumer interaction. And so I did a brief stint at the soccer club. I think I was there for a total of really 2 years at the club, and 2 other years helping build it. So was certainly a fun chapter.
Is the O.H. Ingram whiskey line a separate business from all of this, or does it fall under an umbrella with any other?
No, this is my own. So um, back when I was conceptualizing this, it was really a business school project, and I took a class that required you to come up with a concept that to create a business. And I think there were 40 people in the class, and 8 people were, everybody had to present an idea. 8 people were then chosen based on the strength of the idea to then, over the course of a 8-week class, put together a team, come up with a business plan, and finally present at the end of it. So I did this. I put together this business plan with some classmates, which business school, the best thing that came out of that, I think, was I got a free business plan out of it, or at least I'm hoping that business plan will pay off the investment. But
Sure.
uh, so I came out of school with this idea. We actually won our class project, came in first for the business plan, and at that time I was in business school, and business school does not pay at all. So I had this idea, but no means to really make it come together. So uh, I spoke with some in my family, and I said, "Hey, I'd really like to try this out." And their response was, "Sounds fun. Um, Not really sure we think this is a real business. It's kind of a crazy idea. And oh, by the way, what happens if the whiskey explodes?" They started to ask, risk mitigation questions and all these things that
Right, right.
I just wanted to make whiskey and, see if we could make it taste better by putting it in a barge. Um, I had to get them over what that meant too, but that was where that marketing came in handy. And so I I started Brown Water Spirits. In the barge business, we call the river the brown water, right? Well, that's what
Yep.
they also call uh, bourbon. So it seemed
Yeah.
fitting to me.
Hmm.
Uh, again, I'm a finance guy. I'm not a marketing guy, so uh, I just had to have some name to put the all the permits that we were going to have to pursue under. So started Brown Water Spirits in 2015, and set out to put whiskey on a barge, which, as I soon came to find out, is a lot harder than just taking a whiskey barrel and putting it on a barge, because uh, there's rules, there's regulations. Um, People want to have taxes paid, and you have to be set up in systems for those taxes to be collected, and you have to file taxes. So the simple idea of let's put whiskey on a barge and see what happens was about a 18-month journey to just put a barrel on a barge. So it's quite the learning opportunity.
Right. And I'd like to get back into those details a little bit later. But I think I saw you studied Spanish language in undergrad.
See?
Were you always drawn to foreign languages academically, or were you growing up in school drawn to anything else specifically?
Well, originally I started out actually taking French in like first grade. Didn't know anything about the culture of France, or really the Spanish culture either. It was just kind of a class to take. But switched over. My mom switched me over to Spanish, and said, I think this is something you need to learn. There's a bit of a demographic shift going on. Of course, she never made those justifications. She said, you're taking Spanish now. I said, okay. And I really uh, enjoyed uh, being able to read another language. I mean, just the simple joy of reading the Spanish instructions and the English instructions on the warning label of what not to do. I'm like, I get that. Um, and it's come in handy in my adult life. Certainly with travel to South America, uh, but you know, I think being able to think and speak in two languages is um, it's an interesting concept to Americans. It's a given to Europeans. So as I've run across Europeans, I say, well, how many languages do you speak? And they're like, duh, like five. So yeah, I think it's eye-opening if
Right.
you start hanging out with Germans or Italians or whatever. They're just like, well, our country is the size of Kentucky, so yeah, we can't just rely on one to even
Right.
drive 3 hours away.
Right. When did you first take notice of the barge company and the book company? When did it become something more than just my dad leaves and gets back?
Y- you know, um, I would say it probably wasn't until high school when I started to take a little bit more of an interest in. I've always liked to tinker, and unfortunately, usually take things apart. Putting them back together was always the trick. I was really good at taking them
Yeah.
apart.
Yeah.
I had remote control cars. I do remote control planes, uh, and I crashed a lot of planes. uh, remote control. But I kept kind of like upgrading for some reason. It's like, okay, great. Well, I know I haven't mastered this level, but I want to throw ailerons in there and things that are other axes of error. So I've always liked to push myself and play around with things. In high school, I think that's kind of when you you start to kind of realize, okay, what do your parents do when they're not at home, and ask those questions. Um, and again, I think to me the barges, uh, the more I spent time on them, the more I just loved uh, the the mechanics of the engine room, and I loved remote control cars. uh, I'd go into a towboat engine room, and I mean, you just talk about it's kind of like walking into a Home Depot. You just look around, and it's just there's so much
Right.
potential here. There's so many
Yep.
things I could touch, and so that I think is where I started to get interested. It wasn't so much on a business side, but as a I just want to know how all this stuff works, which my dad, it drove him crazy because I'd always break the router, or I'd always do something on the computer, and he'd come home and it's like, why isn't it the way I left it?
Right.
So Hank on a boat was always keep Hank away from touching everything because he's going to want to push all the buttons, and Lord knows what happens.
Right.
But
Oh,
yeah,
did you work for the barge company, or was that just getting on when you can?
um, I'd say I didn't work for the barge company until I got out of college on the physical side of it. When I was in college, I did internships at the barge company every year in the office, and I'd take trips out to see the facilities. But I wasn't after college. I spent a time as a deckhand just to kind of understand all aspects of it. But um, in college, I really got into computer science, and so I said, okay, I want to work in the computer science, or I was doing programming, so I came back and said I want to work in IT at the company. And classroom IT and company IT are a little different. It was quite the eye-opening experience. Um, I think some of the folks that are at Ingram today would still remember me sitting over their shoulder, and it's kind of like, okay, so we're going to do this SQL query. I'm like, cool. It's like, all right, then we're going to do this query. I'm like, okay, I want to write a program. It's like, well, we're writing a program over here. I'm like, great. Like, yeah, it's going to be done in 3 years. I'm like, man, I don't know if I have the patience. So
Yeah.
um, I still enjoy computers, but I think I learned I can't sit still long enough to type out code and submit it to a report. And yeah, I think I learned a lot about how just the business of IT works, which was pretty cool. But um, it ultimately wasn't for me. But then I took some accounting classes and spent some time in accounting, spent some time with sales. So I really got the opportunity to see all areas of the business. But I'd always come back to what interested me the most was always where the work was done. And I love nothing more than going out to Paducah, getting on a dock string. David Surt, who was our head of engineering for a long time, uh, I'd always go out with him. He was always, yeah. I think what's always been cool is our engineering people are so much fun to be around because they love to tinker
Right.
and build things. And
Yep.
looking at a big boat is cool, but when you can have somebody walk you through and show you all the odds and ends, I just love spending time around those guys because and not to mention they had all kinds of good stories.
But what led you to finance? Did you actually find that interesting? Because I was not a big fan myself.
So um, I was always told take accounting, take finance. You're going to hate me for it, but do it because it's worthwhile and everything comes down to the numbers. Um, I was a business major. I was a business and Spanish major at Washington and Lee. Uh, I knew I wanted to go into business. I love the idea of building things. Um, I uh, I just knew accounting was part of it. And my grandfather, my maternal grandfather, he was a accounting major and a lawyer, and he did a lot in business. And while I don't ever remember a time at home we talked about numbers of the business. It was always, well, you know, you need to understand the concept that you need to know where the cash is, how much is coming in, how much is going out, and the difference is what you get to keep. It's pretty simple. Well, then you get into an accounting class in college, and um, simple is not the term I would use to describe an
Right.
accounting class.
Nor
Uh,
I.
but but I think if you treat it like a puzzle, and um, every every dollar that comes in, double or accrual accounting, where you have debits and credits. When you have an input on one side, you have an output on the other, and there's an offsetting, and finding where that moves. My appreciation really grew in business school as I learned to build a whiskey company. You really have to understand cash flow, because an income statement, great profit loss. Well, when you're in a business that requires a lot of cash to put down into barrels of inventory that you don't touch for years, you find very quickly you can be profitable and run out of money, because if you're putting away all this inventory of whiskey, even though your net income is positive, that doesn't say I've got cash in the bank to pay my bills.
Right.
Um, so it's a long way of saying accounting to me has been more of a necessary evil, but over time I've come to appreciate just how important it is, and it's kind of like doing a Sudoku, or if you like to do a crossword, you can sit around and say, I want to think through this concept. How is that going to flow through all the, you start with a dollar here, and by the time you run it through all the accounts and the journals and the offsetting, whatever, just make it fun.
All right. Well, that brings us, I guess, to the whiskey project. Of course, you said you got all your permits lined up and your taxes and all that stuff about 18 months before the first barrel went into the barge. What is that physical process? I mean, is you pulling covers and lowering by crane one by one? Tell me about that.
Well, and so when we first started out, um, let me begin by saying the biggest surprise for me was after business school when I started. You have to have lawyers look through this stuff because it's just the way the code's written. Everybody I talked to said, well, you can clearly see right here in the codes, it says that it is illegal to warehouse spirits on a vessel. Um, oh, I didn't know that. So turns out the tax man wants to know where the money is.
Yeah.
Yeah. So um, it took us a minute, but we were able to find a lawyer who had actually been to a tax conference earlier, like a week before, and they talked about the Supreme Court case that came down. It basically said, just because you float, you're not automatically a vessel. You kind of have this test that you have to meet, and we use that logic to apply for an experimental permit, which allows us, or really allows the regulators the freedom, flexibility to um, allow a person to try new things, even if it may be against the code. So once we got that determination, that setup, it was uh, now how do you get a barrel on a barge? And so I cobbled together kind of what I'd saved up to that point, and I bought a few barrels to run this test. And we did it out of Metropolis, at our Ingram facility up there. I chartered the barge. Well, actually, um, it was a spar barge, and I chartered about 20 feet of it. Uh,
Got you. Got you.
Thank, yeah, that was where accounting came in handy because I only needed, 20 square feet, so I didn't want the whole barge. I just wanted and a spar barge doesn't have a great economic opportunity. So, uh, I think they said, what was he thinking? He paid us for 20 square foot of a barge that was a sunk cost anyway. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
uh, anyways, we worked out an arrangement, and so the semi truck shows up with 6 barrels, and looking back on it now, I think it's absolutely crazy that I used a 53-foot semi trailer to haul 6 barrels. Okay, normally those things are moving 90 barrels.
Right.
Yeah, full barrels. So, but now this truck shows up. It pulls in, heart's going. Here is the first time I'm about to touch my own whiskey barrel. Been
Hmm.
waiting on this, and open up the trailer, and I'm like, oh no, these barrels, they're stood up on their head, and they're all the way back in the back of the trailer. And I'm thinking, oh no. And Lee Jennings was there with me. Um, and Lee was running the Metropolis facility at the time. And I look over at Lee, and he looks at me, and we're like, how do we get the barrels out? And he had a picker. He said, well, I think we can maybe telescope this thing all the way in, and maybe we can get the forks around it. And meanwhile, the truck driver gets out. He's like, what the hell's taking so long? We're like, well, how do we get the barrels out? He goes, oh, hell, let me show you. He goes over there. Yeah, this is a 60-something-year-old man. He gets his arm around this thing, bear hugs it, and just throws it to the ground. And I I almost threw up because because these barrels aren't cheap, and this guy just
Right.
threw the barrel,
Right.
and he said, "Oh hell, they dropped these things out of two-story building, no problem." And I kind of said, "Oh, okay." And he's like, "Yeah, just throw them around." So we started rolling these barrels, and quickly realized they are stout. I mean, if you go to Jack Daniel's, for instance, or several of the distilleries in Kentucky, you'll actually see they have bars on the first story and the second story of the warehouse. And the first story is to keep people from getting out. The second story is to keep barrels in, because there was a time when people would actually roll barrels out of that second story. It would bounce, be perfectly fine, and they would roll it away and steal the whiskey. So
No,
that's how
no
strong a bourbon
kidding.
barrel is. Yeah.
How many, is it measured in gallons, purchased in gallons or liters or by barrel?
Well, by barrel, but there's different size barrels, but the pretty much the industry standard for bourbon is a 53-gallon barrel. It's New American charred oak. We use number 4 char, which means it's been in there for, I think they cook it for like almost 2 minutes with a flame, and that chars the barrel, which caramelizes the sugars inside the wood, so the whiskey can get in there and start to extract that flavor. But to your original question of how did we get it into the barge? Well, we built some racks, which uh, these things they're the most impressive looking racks you've ever seen. I mean, it was really a work of art. I mean, we're talking some big tubes of steel, and like had wood in there that had been cut out to allow the barrel to be cradled, and I mean, it was really pretty. And we had the idea of, oh, okay, well, we don't want anybody out here seeing us load barrels into the barge, so we put which, I mean, if you've been to Metropolis, there's not a lot of people around, but there may
Right.
be one guy that slips a word. So we put plywood and wrapped it in plywood, and then moved the covers, dropped it in there, and left it, and um, came back 6 months later, which by this point everybody knew that something was going on, but they didn't know which barge, because we'd hidden it pretty well. And I'd get in the barge and I go over with my drill and tap into it. And man, after just 6 months, and this was raw whiskey when it went in. I mean, it was brand new. It tasted so good. It was so smooth. Um, but it was still 6 month old whiskey, but I didn't know any better. I was like, oh, I can taste it. I can taste it. You got to start out with good juice first.
Right.
That's helpful. Um,
Right.
but we had some control barrels that we tried it against, and we could really see in just 6 months' time, we were getting a different impact inside the barrel. There was something going on. It was smoother. It was softer. Um, the color was a little darker. Yeah, and again, 6 months is not long in bourbon world. I mean, that's a blink of an eye for what some of these barrels, how long they sit.
Sure.
But it was enough to get us excited and say, okay, we got to fill up a barge and go from there. I will say, just as an aside, we used two barges we did a steel top barge and a fiberglass cover barge. Um, the fiberglass barge won out in the end. Something about the the way the all steel construction, it sweated, it kept too much humidity in, it didn't work out so great. But uh, after about 4 months, um, we go back out before the 6 month mark to just check on the barge, and the steel top barge had sunk with the whiskey in it.
Well, that's not good.
I still have those barrels, and they are funky looking. I mean, they look like they've been sitting in the water for a minute. It was probably in the water for about a month before anybody noticed, but just kind of the trials and tribulations of bringing something like that together. Great, we got to fish our barrels out of the river.
Has that barge been scrapped or is it refloated somewhere?
Oh gosh, by now it's probably gone. This would have been
And
'07, so it was, or no, 17. It would have been on its last legs then. So 5 years, 6 years ago. Yeah, I bet
sure.
it's somewhere else now.
And then how much longer until your first offering? And then, of course, we'll go through each offering so far and what your plans are. But how long did you age the stuff until the straight whiskey came out, the white label?
Yeah, sure, sure. So, um, okay, so we prove to ourselves that there's something going on with this barge concept. So now we had to get the full operating permit together. Um, that took another year and a half. So um, I want to say we began in the summer of 17 and didn't really get our final permit until almost 2019. Uh, Part of that was, even though we had this determination letter from the experimental permit that yes, this was an approved, you know, thing, um, we still had to convince the folks at the other, department in the agency that oversees us, which is the Tobacco, Alcohol, Tax and Trade Bureau, the TTT, the TTB. We had to convince them that yes, it's okay. You can approve this. Nobody got fired for rubber stamping, what the last guy approved. But anytime you're going to be the first to approve something new, it gets a little extra scrutiny. So we had to go through that, and then started loading barrels in 2019. So January of 2019, more or less. Um, Now, if you haven't noticed a theme here, I'll just highlight it, which is I like to tinker with things of which I have very little knowledge. I didn't know anything about whiskey. I knew how to surround myself with folks that knew things about whiskey and could advise us. But the one question I forgot to ask was, okay, how do you load whiskey into a barge? Um, and we came up with all kinds of different prototypes. Um, we originally started out by loading a 20-foot shipping container that we would crane in, and then we'd pull them out of that, So they were in the barge, and then we'd have to get them into the racks. Well, how do you get them into the racks inside a barge? I was like, okay, well, how about a forklift? Well, to move a forklift around inside the barge, it was going to eat up way too much space and not leave us enough room to keep barrels. And I'm always keeping in the back of my mind, I know what I get charged for this barge because nothing in life is free. Um, and I'm like, okay, the more barrels I can get on there, the lower the cost, So really that finance background and cash flow in my mind started to kick in. So I thought I found the solution. I got onto Granger Supply and I ordered two, not one, but two, because I figured two's faster than one, which proved out to be correct. Um, Foot operated hydraulic lifts, pallet stackers,
Okay.
basically. All
Okay.
right. So
Yeah.
these barrels are each 550 pounds. And I said, well, let's make sure we can get the forks long enough so we can lift two barrels at a time. And so these things show up uh, before the first truck is supposed to come in. And we're going to load 300 barrels in over the course of a week, 90 at a time per truck. So these things show up. We got them in the barge, and I put my foot on it, and I start pumping, and I go, uh, this isn't great. It's slow. It takes a good couple 20, 30 seconds just to get to the first level empty. Okay, well, I think we can make this work. It only cost me between the two. I think they were like $1,500 a piece. So I was frugal. I'm gonna keep more money into the barrels. Wasn't gonna mess with the creature comforts because this is a startup and we got to run it lean. So um, uh, I had told all my friends that been talking to them ad nauseum about this project, and so they all show up. Like five or six of them. We've got a duck hunting camp that's like 20 minutes away from this barge, which we'd put in Wickliffe at that point, at the James Marine facility there in Wickliffe. And they're all excited. We get there the night before. Everybody's you know, chatty. I realized pretty quickly I may have miscommunicated because they all thought that they were going to be there to drink my whiskey. They didn't realize that they were going to have to work to load whiskey. So there was a disconnect between the expectations and reality. So next morning we get there early. This is when I learned a thing about logistics. Um, the James Marine, they work from I guess 5 to 2 on their shift, and take breaks. And so the truck is on its way and it gets there at about 10 o'clock, and that's break time. I'm like, okay, all right. So it's okay. So they come back after break, and this is in the summertime, so it was kind of warm um, when we start loading everything. No, I guess it was early spring or mid spring, but regardless, it was a warm day. We open up the truck, bam, fumes, just that beautiful smell just hits you. And everybody's, oh, we're
Yeah.
excited, excited. Well, then we start loading the whiskey barrels into this container. It could hold like 55 at a time. We truck it down, and then they crane it in to the barge with a giant Manitowoc crane. I'm like, this may not be the most efficient thing, but well, it's first run. We'll see. Barrels get in. Oh, and I'd also hired a video crew to, document the day and get content for the website and everything. So,
Sure. Sure.
yeah, so we're out there, and I get two barrels up onto my pallet stacker, and I start pumping. And that's when I realized that hydraulics under pressure act different than hydraulics that are just, free weight.
Right.
And so where it had taken me maybe 10 seconds to get to that first level without weight on it, once you put 1,100 pounds, it took about 2 minutes of straight pumping. And then you have to clock the barrels in such a way that when they stop rolling, that their bung, the hole is facing straight up. That way the whiskey doesn't pop it out and you lose the contents. Um, so we roll it in, and the barrel gets crooked. It gets caught in the racks. we could not get the clocking right for the first like 3 hours, and we did, I don't know, I think we did like 10 barrels an hour. It was horribly slow. Three guys didn't even show up after lunch. I mean, it was a we realized very quickly that we were beyond our skis. But one guy happened to stick it out, and uh, he was built like an ox, and I was glad to have him as my friend Scott, and and everybody else pretty much ran away, and Scott stuck it out and was like, you know what, man, you didn't know it, but this was a job interview, you passed, um, and I hired him. I was like, I gotta have you on board here. So um,
Yeah.
it was pretty much that's when Scott joined us, uh, and now he's our master blender. But that's got its own story because turns out not only could he move barrels, but he also could taste them and describe what he was tasting uh, more so than anybody I've ever seen. So I got so stinking lucky. But uh, ultimately, this barge is now it's now got that first barge is a little smaller. It's got 1,800 barrels on it. We just had our second barge built. We've loaded 800 barrels on it. So we did 800 barrels in 3 days this last November. It was about November 15th, actually, that
Okay.
week. Uh, so we learned a few things. We perfected the process. But I think back on that first time when we started loading. Um, uh, it, it turns out you get what you pay for, and it helps to ask questions of people that know. And they said, "Well, why don't you just buy a Ricker?" I'm like, what the heck is a Ricker? Well, a Ricker in the bourbon world is what everybody has. It's this little hydraulic platform that, with the press of a button, it goes up. You can load 100 barrels in 2 hours with it, uh, versus,
Okay.
yeah, and it's
Right.
electric. But uh, wow, that those first couple of days, and the word, I just remember the sheer fear I felt because that first truck, we were only had taken like 30 barrels out of it, and the second truck showed up, and he's wanting to be unloaded, and I was getting demurrage and detention charges, and it was going horrible. So we had to pivot. We had to. Um, that was a learning opportunity that operations is best tinkered with on a small scale, but before you try to do it all in one shot.
What can you tell me? I know a little bit about the production and aging of whiskey until I guess from start till it arrives in your barge.
Yeah. Look, I'll be very frank and say I know less about the distillation process than I do the aging process. So, um, up until really so bourbon's going on a bit of a bourbon boom these days. If you look back in the 70s was really the peak of consumption of bourbon, and I think what is interesting today is we as a country have not uh, started to consume the level of bourbon that we did in the mid 70s, even though we have 50, 60 million more people of drinking age in this country than we did in the 70s. So um, when people look at the data and with the cocktail culture and all this, there is a big run, but bourbon really fell out of favor until about the mid 90s and really the early 2000s. Mad Men, cocktail culture that came about, and bourbon began to see some serious growth. And when I got into it, or was first exposed to it in 2015, it'd been on this kind of 7 year, 6% a year growth trend. I said, well, gosh, I hope I'm not too late. Well, since I've been in it, it's been closer to 8, 9, 10% a year in growth in
Sure.
sales.
Right.
So bourbon's having a minute, but in the 80s, as bourbon was in serious decline, there was only about 7 or 8 big distilleries in Kentucky. I just saw a statistic the other day. Nationwide, there's now 2,200 craft distilleries, uh, up from like 200 10 years ago. So when you look at that landscape, whiskey is a product that takes time. You make it, you have to age it and sit on it. Um, in 2009, there were a lot of brands that were coming to market all of a sudden. Again, kind of as this whiskey boom is taking off, people are trying to get into it. Bellmead Bourbon here in Nashville, they were one of the kind of the early guys to get in, I'd say, of the current boom, which we're more or less kind of in the back end of now, I think. Seagram's had a plant in Lawrenceburg, Indiana, and uh, Seagram's had to give up that plant, and it was bought by a company in Kansas called MGP, Midwest Grain Products. And when they bought that facility, they didn't know much about the bourbon market. And so they started selling off aged whiskey, and you could get 10-year-old whiskey, I hear, for $2,000 a barrel, which in today's day with inflation and whatnot, it a new barrel of whiskey, a year-old barrel of whiskey, actually is trading for about that. So you imagine starting a whiskey brand with product that is 10 years old. You know, uh, you're a 18-month-old company and you got a 10-year-old juice. Well, you're getting it from somewhere else, and that's where a lot of these newer brands, newer being in the last 10 years, started, was on the backs of um, a lot of them were MGP out of Indiana, uh, and that old Seagram's juice. Well, they hired a guy from Maker's Mark to lead up their sales efforts, and they just started raising prices, and people kept buying, and eventually, I'd say the market was set, and you see an 8-year-old Kentucky uh, bourbon, that it may trade for $8,000-9,000 a barrel, and that's before it's got a brand on it and even bottled. Um, and so the prices
That
that the
that's
juice
in
is taken,
today's market.
that's in
That's
today's
in
market.
today's
Yeah,
market, nine thousand
that's
dollars.
today's. Yeah,
No
yeah,
kidding.
yeah. No, it is. Um, and Kentucky commands a premium because it's Kentucky, and Kentucky and bourbon are, 1 and 1. But yeah, it's been a big growth. But so all that to say, we started out with that same place at MGP, and a lot of your listeners that are bourbon drinkers will recognize that name. But MGP was really kind of the first in the contract distillation game. Um, we started out, that's where those barrels from the first batch, that first experimental, came from, and that's where they are now. Um, or excuse me, that's where we started with for our straight whiskey, which was our white label. We've now moved all of our production to Owensboro. There's a distillery there called Green River. We've been laying down whiskey with them since I want to say it was 2018. So everything that we are bottling now, we are pretty much, I think we're 100% through our MGP stash. So everything now is Green River out of Owensboro. But I say all that to say there is uh, the distillation process. You take the corns, which bourbon is a majority corn, whiskey is a distilled grain, bourbon is a subcategory of that. It has to be made in the United States, kind of like how Scotch has to be made in Scotland. Um, and then you have to use a new charred oak barrel. You can't reuse barrels for bourbon. Bourbon barrels are typically sent to Scotland for Scotch once they're used, um, or the Caribbean for rum, but can't reuse a barrel for bourbon. And once you hit 4 years old, you don't have to tell anybody how old it is. Uh, some do, some don't. Once it's 2 years old, it becomes straight. So if it says straight on the bottle, it's at least 2 years. If it doesn't have an age statement, then you know it's at least 4. Um, the 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 grains come in to the distillery. They process them. They hammer them. They smash them up. And they put them in, uh, a vat basically, add water, yeast. Uh, the yeast converts the sugars in the grains to alcohol, and then you basically cook off the alcohol, and then in the distillation process, and it gets condensed, and so you concentrate. You start with what is essentially a beer with a 5%, 6% alcohol content, and bring that down to 140 proof more or less, which is 70% alcohol.
Right.
They then will add water to that to get it to the barrel proof, and that's your barrel entry proof. Um, so once it goes into that barrel, that new charred oak barrel, um, that's where we come in. So we contract with the distillery out of at Green River. They are making whiskey for a lot of people. They've got a big operation that I think, you know, tens of thousands of barrels a year capacity, and distillation is really a scale game. Unlike craft beer, where you can make a really good craft beer and be a small guy, uh, whiskey you really need all the bells and whistles because the quality control is so important. And so it's almost the reversed in whiskey, that the bigger producers tend to make the better stuff. uh, they've also got the capital to experiment, where the younger guys usually a little bit more restrained. So we'll take that barrel once it's been full. Now we contract, we don't source. So the sourcing model is where you find that 10-year-old barrel and you slap your label on it. Contract is where you say, here's what I want you to make, here's how I want you to make it, and here's what I want you to put it in. And they say, okay, here's your price. Then we take it. So that barrel gets full. That's when we start. So we pick up.
Is is there a minimum barrel purchase for certain mash bills and things?
Yeah, certainly. Good question. Yes, it depends on the size of the distillery. Um, Normally, it's 200 to 300 barrels, uh, and so we're buying enough in bulk and have been for a couple years now that we're able to buy what we want, and make it the way we want it, and not have to say, okay, well, what's just off the shelf. So
Right.
so we take that barrel, we'll bring it over to the barge, and then we load it in the barge, and that's where the aging begins, right? So distillation takes a week, from grain to barrel, and then uh, the aging is years, right? So inside that barge, we've got temperature, we've got heat, and we've got humidity that is different from any other warehouse. We call them rick houses or barrel houses in
Right.
Kentucky.
Right.
Yeah. So um, the motion encourages the whiskey to slosh around and interact more with the barrel, which is where the aging occurs. The heat, the humidity drives the whiskey in and out of the barrel. Big heat changes. Heat opens the pores, cold close them up. So kind of moving them in and out of the wood. And then humidity allows the sugars of the barrel to stay moist and active, and it's kind of uh, a a syrup will dissolve easier than a cube of sugar, kind of the same concept. And so it's all about extracting the flavor out of that barrel. And so we'll take it, put it in the barge, and we don't pull it off till it's time to bottle, which is, um, to my knowledge, uh, the only floating barrel house. It's certainly in the United States, but possibly the world. And we've got a patent pending in the U.S. and Canada for it, and actually a granted patent in the U.K. So uh, should be the only people, barge aging whiskey for a few years to come.
Sure. How long did you age the straight whiskey? And how old was it when you acquired? I guess what was the process for each offering?
So the straight whiskey, we uh, did not age completely in the barge. We put it in there it had about a year and a half of age on it, and we let it go another 2 years inside the barge before we started pulling it off. And part of that is I didn't want to be having this conversation with you a year and a half from now. It's certainly you got to pay the bills. So we came out with the straight whiskey. It had a little bit of terra firma aging on it, and it was really kind of a happy accident. You've got the red label back there. The reds are rye, and so the straight whiskey was originally going to be a way for us to approximate the mash bill of the rye. And so we took a rye bourbon and a rye base bourbon, so still majority corn, and then a rye whiskey, which was almost predominantly rye, and mixed them together. And I was going to make that my rye, uh, playing around with it. As we went through the labeling process, found out that well, actually, when you make take a bourbon and a rye and you mix them together, you can't call it a bourbon or a rye because it kind of violates the conventions of the two. So you have to go up to the next broadest category, which is whiskey. So it's a straight whiskey because it's 2 years old at least, right? So um, that was where that came about. Now the white color. Uh, it was originally our first release was going to be blue, and I kind of had a pause moment. I said, well, hang on. If I've got to call this a straight whiskey, I really like the blue. I'm going to reformulate the way that we think about this. I said, let's go with white because white for whiskey, and then we'll do blue for bourbon or the B's for bourbon and yeah, blue and black, and then red for rye. And so that's kind of where the colors come from. Is just rye starts with R, red starts with R. Um, so the straight whiskey was originally going to have a 3 barrel blend, or 3 different mash bills rather. Usually it's about a 20 barrels or so, 20 to 30 barrels, depending on what we have available. The black label there that you have, that's our flagship. Well, as we got to tasting the barrels that were going to go into the straight whiskey, uh, there was one particular mash bill that was absolutely excellent. And I said, I can't blend this into something else. We got to have some way to showcase how good this whiskey is, and that's where we came up with the idea of, well, Old Forester has this expression called the birthday bourbon, which is kind of meant to be every year their favorite whiskey profiled under one expression. So we came up with the idea, why don't we create this flagship? Uh, and this is where we'll put our best stuff. And we'll make it an annual release to where each year, as we're tasting barrels and setting them aside, we'll say, okay, our best goes into the black. And you can actually thank your one of your previous guests, Turbo Hughes, for the name flagship, because I was trying to figure out reserve and private select. Those are really overused, in my opinion. And I called up Turbo one day. I'm like, as my resident towboat creative, I said, what do you think? What should I call this thing? He says, "Oh hell, man, yeah, I call it flagship. That's the best boat in the fleet." And in his way, um,
Yeah.
yeah, I think he threw some color around. Like, oh hell, that's what I do. And
Yeah.
yeah, he put out the cigarette. And so, anyways, flagship is where that name came from because it's the biggest, the baddest vessel in your fleet. I think we got the barge thing going on, so let's call it flagship. That's where that name came from. And the last one that you have there, that's our blue label is our bourbon. So this is really our house bourbon, 105 proof. It's a wheat based mash bill. I tend to go to wheat bourbons. That's just always been my attraction. Wheat is a softer grain than rye. It actually takes it a little bit longer because um, wheat bourbons tend to be a little bit more viscous, so they don't have that penetration into the wood as quickly as, say, a rye-based bourbon, which tends to be a little thinner. Uh, but I think the wheat has reacted extremely well to the barge, and we haven't even started to get into those higher up barrels inside the barge. Um, Again, because I tried to load them with a foot operated pallet jack. And so it wasn't till a little bit later on that we got the right equipment to go higher up in the racks where you get a much hotter temperature environment. And that hotter the temperature, the more it pushes the whiskey into the wood. And And
Right.
so we got a couple barrels that'll be coming out of that here in the next year that I'm really excited about. The color extraction they have, um, it's pretty good. So what happens is we go through, we take 100 barrel sample, kind of a cross section from high, low, middle, and we just taste them. And we'll taste through about 100 different barrels, narrow it down to 20 barrels or so, and that's our blend. And so we're looking for um, certain qualities. Uh, Sometimes you don't want to just take uh, all these barrels that taste really sweet. Sometimes you want to throw in a barrel that's gotten maybe a little bit of woodiness to it to kind of come in and even out some sweetness with some spice. Or so as you are uh, tasting through this barrel house, you'll find that bourbon barrels in different locations will develop a profile totally different than say even its neighbor, and it's just based on the wood that was used in that barrel. Maybe there was a little draft that it changed the way the air moved. It's really cool. Uh, we're still trying to figure out, is there a sweet spot in the barge, but so far it seems to be every single barrel.
I think you told me at the it was, I think, a 2 or 3 boat christening there in Reserve that the straight whiskey would be discontinued. Is that still the plan?
Yeah, so we did not buy any more of the components for that particular blend, and part of that was, I really wanted to invest more into the bourbon, the Blue Label. Um,
Sure.
I didn't know at the time. You're making these inventory decisions years in advance.
Right.
Yeah, I didn't know how well it was going to go over, and so we may bring it back. I certainly like each of those components of the mash bill that we played around with, but you know, as far as focusing on a core lineup, I think having these three, the bourbon, the flagship, and the rye, and then we're also playing around with a potential single barrel release, which could reuse that white color down the road. Um, that's where we're moving the brand towards.
Okay. Is there any other expansion you're looking to do, or does that pretty much cover the extent of your intentions?
Well, that's it on the lineup wise. We just recently moved our barges to the Ingram barge facility in Columbus. So, um, from a expansion standpoint, it's going to be focused on loading up more barges at this point. And Columbus is, in my mind, one of the prettiest parts of Kentucky. I mean, it's almost like you take the bluegrass region, instead of horses, you put cornfields, and driving out there, I think it could be a really cool um, attraction one day to have this on the river. So I think where my head is now is make sure we make good product, and then keep growing the brand, and keep growing the whiskey stocks.
Where are these 2 barges floating around right now?
They're in Columbus.
Okay.
Yeah,
Just tied up
at
in the
a
fleet?
they're somewhere in an undisclosed location within a 10-mile range. I
Sure.
will say you're probably going to see them stand out before too long. There's this microflora, they call it, that grows in the presence of alcohol, and so it pretty much turns everything downstream and downwind black with this
Okay.
organism that grows only in the presence of whiskey. So our first barge started out with a white fiberglass cover. It's now purely black.
Hmm.
So they um, and it's funny. The guys at James Marine would always say, "Can we scrub that off? Can we clean that up for you? We'll do it free of charge." It's just, we're tired of looking at it. I'm like, no, 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 guys. That is a that is a sign of you're in the business.
Right.
People work really hard to get that patina, what I like to call it.
Is there any intention or talk to slap these into a tow that goes down and back up?
No, no, well, we have to be sensitive on the whiskey on a vessel, right? So,
Okay.
um,
Right.
if it's permanently moored and at least in that location, we don't violate uh, our covenants that we've made with the
Gotcha.
feds, and they
Sure.
always win.
Yeah. Well, anything else you'd like to share, personally, professionally, anything?
Well, we've got the holidays coming up, so all I can say is, to your listeners that want to learn more, ingramwhiskey.com. There's a little find page on there. You can figure out where you can pick some up nearby, or check us out on Instagram and Facebook. But no, I think this has just been great to talk to you, Tim, and um, excited about your new venture here, and thrilled to be a part of it.
Thanks. Are you available in all the lower 48?
Oh no, we are available mostly along the river, so Minnesota, Wisconsin, Kentucky, Tennessee, and Louisiana. We're talking about launching Ohio and Missouri here this next year, but nothing firm. But I hope to have some news to share there soon.
Okay. And then Sealbox, do they ship to states that aren't listed on your distribution?
Yeah, that's a great question. On our Find Us page, Sealbox is our kind of main internet retailer that we work with. They ship to, I think, 14 additional states that we don't have physical distribution to. So
Okay.
yeah, if you're not in one of those, Sealbox is a great answer.
Well, Hank, listen, I appreciate you joining me here, and I look forward to the next entries into the market.
Well, thank you for all the support, Tim, and great to be with you. Have a Merry Christmas and Happy Holidays to you guys.
Thanks a lot. You too.
All right, bye bye now.